Before screens took over everything, time seemed to move with a different texture. It was not slower in the sense of delay or inefficiency, but slower in the way a river moves when it knows its course and does not need to hurry. Many of us remember days that unfolded without constant interruption, when moments were allowed to breathe and experiences were not immediately framed, recorded, or measured. In those days, life was not organized around notifications or devices, but around light and shadow, sound and silence, habit and expectation. We woke up not to alarms vibrating in our hands, but to familiar noises that belonged to the house itself, to the street, to the morning. The beginning of a day carried a quiet certainty. We knew what would happen, not because it was written down or scheduled in detail, but because it had happened before countless times in much the same way. The morning light entered rooms gradually, touching furniture that had been in the same place for years, sometimes decades. Curtains were drawn by hand, windows opened to let in air that still carried the coolness of night. The world announced itself gently. A passing car, a distant radio, footsteps on the sidewalk, voices greeting one another without urgency. There was no sense of missing something unseen, because attention was already fully occupied by what was present. Inside homes, routines were learned almost without words. We observed them first, absorbed them slowly, and one day realized we were repeating them ourselves. Breakfast was not a performance or a choice among endless options, but a simple and reassuring ritual. The same table, the same cups, the same familiar movements. Food was prepared with economy and care, not because of philosophy, but because that was how it had always been done. Nothing felt minimal or excessive. It was simply enough. Conversation, when it happened, did not compete with anything else. Silence, when it appeared, was not awkward. It belonged there as naturally as speech. Many of us learned early that time had shape. There were moments for work and moments for rest, moments for conversation, and moments for quiet attention. These distinctions were not enforced by rules posted on walls, but by the rhythm of the household and the neighborhood. We watched adults move through their tasks with a sense of purpose that did not need explanation. Work was something done with the hands, the mind, and often the body, and it left visible traces. When something was finished, it could be seen, touched, or used. Completion had weight. Effort had consequence. Outside, the streets carried their own patterns. Children learned the geography of their surroundings not through maps or digital guides, but through repeated walks and encounters. We knew where the pavement cracked, where the trees offered shade, where neighbors stood at certain hours. The street was not an abstract space, but an extension of the home. Faces were familiar, even if names were not always known. A nod, a greeting, a brief exchange of words were enough to establish belonging. There was comfort in being recognized without being examined. Entertainment existed, but it did not dominate. It arrived at certain times and then receded. Radios were turned on and off. Televisions, where they existed, occupied a modest place and demanded collective agreement. What was watched was shared, not customized. What was heard was discussed afterward, not immediately judged. In between, there was room for imagination. Stories were told more often than they were shown. Memory filled the gaps where images were absent. We learned to listen not only to words, but to tone and pause, to what was implied rather than stated. Evenings brought a different quality of attention. As daylight faded, activities naturally changed. There was no sudden shift imposed from outside. Lamps were switched on, one by one. Shadows grew longer. The pace softened. Meals in the evening were not rushed conclusions to a busy day, but central moment around which the rest of the day seemed to gather. The table became a place of quiet continuity. What had happened during the day was recounted without dramatization. Ordinary events were given their proper place, neither inflated nor dismissed. In those years, learning happened through repetition and proximity. We absorbed manners, expectations, and values not through explicit instruction, but by watching how others behaved when no one was watching them closely. We noticed how disagreements were handled, how patience was practiced, how mistakes were acknowledged. There was no constant commentary on behavior. Correction, when it came, was brief and often indirect. Approval was rarely verbalized, but was felt in the smooth continuation of daily life. Objects carried memory in a way that feels unfamiliar now. A chair bore the marks of use. A table held the faint impressions of countless meals. Clothing was mended, adjusted, and passed on, not because of necessity alone, but because familiarity had value. Things stayed long enough to become part of the background of our lives. Their presence was reassuring. We did not expect constant novelty. Change occurred, but slowly, and it was absorbed into the existing order rather than replacing it entirely. Time spent alone was not considered empty. Solitude did not require justification. Many of us remember sitting quietly, watching the movement of light across a wall, listening to distant sounds without feeling compelled to respond. Boredom, when it appeared, was not treated as a problem to be solved immediately. It was a space, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes fertile, where thought could wander and imagination could form without direction. Communication followed its own measured pace. Letters took time to arrive and time to be answered. Conversations were not fragmented by external interruptions. When someone spoke, they had the floor. When someone listened, they listened fully. There was an understanding that not everything required an immediate response. Waiting was part of life, and patience was not a virtue we spoke about often, but one we practiced regularly without naming it. As years passed, seasons marked life more clearly than dates did. Weather shaped routines. Clothing changed with the months. Certain foods appeared and disappeared naturally. We were aware of time passing, but not anxious about it. Aging was visible, but it was gradual and accepted. Older people occupied a clear place in the social fabric. Their presence was steady, their authority quiet. We learned from them not through instruction, but through observation, just as they had learned from those before them. Looking back, many of us realized that the absence of constant screens did not mean the absence of information or stimulation. It meant that attention was directed outward and inward, rather than constantly pulled elsewhere. Experiences were processed slowly, allowed to settle. Memory formed differently, shaped by repetition and emotional weight rather than by endless novelty. What mattered stayed with us because it had room to stay. The world of that time was not simpler in every respect, but it was more contained. Boundaries were clearer. The day had a beginning and an end. Work stayed mostly in its place. Home remained distinct. Public and private spaces were understood intuitively. These distinctions gave structure to life, not as restrictions, but as frameworks within which freedom could exist. As we think back to those years, we do not do so with judgment toward what came later. Change is part of the human story, and each generation adapts to the tools and conditions it inherits. Yet it is natural to notice what has been carried forward and what has been left behind. The habits of attention, the comfort with silence, the acceptance of waiting, the value placed on presence rather than display, all belong to a way of living that shaped us quietly and deeply. What remains with many of us is not a list of events or achievements, but a feeling of continuity. Life did not feel fragmented. One day led into the next with a sense of coherence. We knew where we had come from and had some sense of where we were going, even if the future was uncertain. The past was not distant. It lived in routines, in language, in gestures repeated without thought. Before screens took over everything, we lived more inside moments than beside them. We were not constantly observing ourselves from a distance. We were simply there. And in being there, fully and without distraction, we absorb a way of life that continues to inform how many of us understand time, attention, and the quiet dignity of ordinary days. As the days follow one another, the ordinary flow of life continued to teach us what mattered without ever announcing its lessons. We learned the meaning of responsibility by watching it practiced quietly. Doors were opened and closed at the same hours. Tools were returned to their places. Shoes were left neatly by the entrance. These gestures were not symbolic in the moment, yet over time they formed a language of care and respect that required no explanation. Order was not imposed as a rule, but maintained as a courtesy toward others and toward oneself. Many of us remember how sound shaped our sense of space. Without constant background noise competing for attention, individual sounds carried meaning. A clock ticking in another room marked time more faithfully than any display. The hum of a refrigerator, the creak of a staircase, the closing of a gate outside were all signals that placed us within a living environment. Silence was never complete, but it was generous enough to allow these details to be noticed. Listening was not a skill to be cultivated. It was simply part of being present. Workdays had a physical presence. Whether work happened inside the home or beyond it, it left traces that could be seen and felt. Hands showed signs of use. Clothing carried the marks of activity. Fatigue at the end of the day was not abstract. It was earned and understood. Rest, when it came, was not entertainment disguised as recovery, but genuine restoration. Sitting down after a long day carried a quiet satisfaction that did not need to be shared or displayed. Meals punctuated time in a way that anchored the day. They were moments of return, of reassembly. Even when schedules differed, there was an understanding that food brought people back together, if only briefly. Preparation took time, and that time mattered. Ingredients were handled with familiarity rather than experimentation. Recipes were remembered rather than consulted. The act of cooking connected one generation to another through repeated gestures, through tastes that carried memory more effectively than words. In those years, we learned to wait without resentment. Waiting was woven into daily life. We waited for buses, for letters, for results, for people. Waiting was not experienced as wasted time, but as time in between, time that belonged to no particular demand. It allowed thoughts to settle and observations to form. Impatience existed, of course, but it was tempered by the shared understanding that many things could not be hurried and did not need to be. Social interactions followed a similar rhythm. Visits were planned but not optimized. When someone arrived, they stayed long enough to justify the effort of coming. Conversation unfolded at its own pace. There was no pressure to fill every pause. Stories were told more than once, and repetition did not diminish their value. Each telling carried small variations, shaped by the moment and the listeners. Memory was reinforced through retelling, and shared history was built gradually. We absorbed social norms through proximity rather than instruction. We watched how people greeted one another, how they addressed those older or younger, how they disagreed without escalation. Politeness was not performative. It was woven into speech and gesture so thoroughly that it often went unnoticed. Respect was shown through attention, through patience, through the willingness to listen without interruption. Children learned the boundaries of their world by moving through it physically. Exploration happened on foot, by bicycle, by repeated routes taken until they became familiar. There was a sense of distance that was measured not in numbers, but in effort and time. Going somewhere meant committing to the journey. Returning carried its own satisfaction. These movements built an internal map that extended beyond geography to include relationships and expectations. Objects of leisure were few, but they were used fully. Games were played until pieces wore smooth. Books were reread, their margins marked by memory rather than notes. Music was listened to repeatedly until it became part of the inner landscape. Familiarity did not breed boredom. It created depth. Each return revealed something new, not because the object had changed, but because we had. As evening settled in, the boundary between day and night was clearly felt. Darkness was not something to be overcome, but something to be accommodated. Lighting was adjusted, not intensified. Activities shifted naturally toward conversation, reading, quiet tasks. Sleep came not as an interruption, but as a conclusion. The body recognized when it was time to rest, guided by routine rather than stimulation. Over the years, these patterns formed a steady background against which change occurred. New technologies appeared gradually, and they were integrated cautiously. Novelty did not demand immediate adoption. It was evaluated through use, through observation of its effects on daily life. There was an underlying confidence in existing ways of doing things, a sense that change should serve life rather than reorganize it entirely. The passage of time was marked by events that gathered people together. Celebrations were prepared for and remembered. They did not arrive unexpectedly, nor did they disappear without trace. Anticipation built slowly. Afterward, memory lingered. Photographs existed, but they were few and deliberate. Their scarcity gave them weight. Each image carried a story that could be retold without reference to the picture itself. Learning extended beyond formal settings. Skills were passed on through demonstration. A task was shown once, perhaps twice, and then expected to be attempted. Mistakes were part of the process, acknowledged without excessive commentary. Mastery came gradually, through repetition and patience. Pride in competence was quiet and enduring. Many of us recall how weather influenced mood and movement. Rain altered plans. Heat slowed the pace of the day. Cold encouraged closeness and preparation. These influences were accepted rather than resisted. There was no expectation of complete control. Adaptation was part of living. This acceptance fostered resilience without requiring it to be named. As people aged, their changing roles were visible and understood. There was no abrupt disappearance from daily life. Older individuals remained present, contributing through experience rather than speed. Their stories carried weight because they had been lived, not curated. Younger people listened, sometimes impatiently, sometimes attentively, absorbing more than they realized at the time. Looking back, we can see how these quiet structures supported a sense of continuity. Life felt coherent, even when it was difficult. Challenges were faced within a framework that had proven itself over time. There was comfort in knowing that others before us had navigated similar paths, using similar tools, guided by similar rhythms. Before screens became central to every moment, attention was shaped by the world immediately around us. We looked outward and inward without mediation. Our sense of self developed through interaction rather than reflection alone. Identity was formed slowly, through roles and responsibilities assumed over time, rather than through constant comparison. This way of living did not promise ease or certainty, but it offered steadiness. It allowed people to grow into their lives rather than chase them. The memory of that steadiness remains with many of us, not as a standard to be enforced, but as a reference point, a quiet reminder of how life once unfolded when presence was not divided and time was allowed to keep its own gentle pace. Over time, the sense of belonging that shaped those years revealed itself in small, almost invisible ways. We rarely spoke about community as an abstract idea because it was something lived daily rather than discussed. It existed in repeated encounters, in the predictability of seeing the same faces at familiar hours, in the quiet assurance that one was known, even without intimacy. This recognition did not require constant affirmation. It was established through continuity, through presence maintained over years rather than moments. Many of us remember how trust was built gradually and maintained carefully. Keys were sometimes left with neighbors without ceremony. Children moved through shared spaces with an understanding of unspoken limits. There was a shared responsibility for what happened nearby, not expressed through rules or surveillance, but through attention. If something seemed out of place, it was noticed. If help was needed, it was offered without deliberation. These actions were not framed as virtues. They were simply part of how life functioned. Public spaces carried a sense of order that did not depend on constant enforcement. People adjusted their behavior instinctively, guided by example rather than instruction. Waiting in line, yielding space, speaking in an appropriate volume, all came naturally because they had been observed repeatedly. We learned early that our actions affected others, and this awareness shaped conduct more effectively than any formal lesson could have done. The pace of communication supported this awareness. Without immediate responses expected at every moment, words were chosen with more care. When something was said, it tended to be meant. Silence, too, carried meaning. It allowed for consideration, for restraint, for respect. There was an understanding that not everything needed to be expressed immediately, and that some things were better left unsaid until they had settled. Workplaces reflected similar patterns. Hierarchies existed, but they were often softened by familiarity. Authority was recognized, yet it was usually exercised through presence rather than assertion. Experience commanded respect without demanding it. Younger individuals learned their roles by observing how tasks were performed and how decisions were made. Mistakes were corrected quietly, often privately, preserving dignity rather than undermining it. The physicality of tools and materials reinforced this learning. Objects had weight and resistance. They required attention and care. A mistake could not be undone instantly. This fostered patience and responsibility. We learned to measure twice before acting, not as a slogan, but as a practical necessity. Precision developed naturally, shaped by consequences that were immediate and tangible. Leisure, too, followed this principle of engagement. Free time was not something to be filled at all costs, but something to be inhabited. Walking, sitting, observing. These were acceptable ways to spend an afternoon. There was no pressure to document or justify these moments. Their value lay in the experience itself, not in any external recognition. Seasonal changes reinforced a sense of time passing with purpose. Certain activities belonged to certain months. Preparation was part of enjoyment. Anticipation extended pleasure rather than diminishing it. When something arrived, it felt earned through waiting. When it passed, it left behind memory rather than disappointment. Many of us recall how learning continued well beyond formal education. Skills were refined over years of repetition. There was pride in doing something well, even if no one else noticed. Competence was its own reward. It carried a quiet confidence that did not require validation. One knew what one could do, and that knowledge was enough. As families evolved, roles shifted gradually. Responsibilities were assumed naturally, often without explicit discussion. Care for others was integrated into daily life rather than treated as a separate obligation. This integration reinforced a sense of continuity between generations. Younger people saw their future reflected in those who came before them, not as a burden, but as a path already walked. Memory in those years was shaped by repetition rather than accumulation. Events stood out because they were distinct, not because they were numerous. Ordinary days blended together, forming a stable background against which significant moments emerged clearly. This balance allowed life to feel full without feeling crowded. Looking back now, many of us recognize that the absence of constant stimulation allowed for a deeper engagement with what was present. Attention was not divided endlessly. It was directed and sustained. This sustained attention fostered understanding, empathy, and patience. It allowed relationships to deepen gradually, without pressure or performance. The passage of years brought change, of course, but arrived incrementally. New habits were layered onto old ones rather than replacing them entirely. There was time to adapt, to reflect, to decide what to keep and what to let go. This gradual transition preserved a sense of identity rooted in continuity rather than disruption. As screens began to appear more frequently, they entered a world already structured by these rhythms. At first, they occupied a limited place. They were additions, not replacements. Life continued to revolve around physical presence, shared routines, and unmediated experience. The foundation had been laid over decades, and it was strong. What remains with many of us is the memory of a life lived in proportion. Attention was balanced between self and surroundings, between activity and rest, between speech and silence. There was room for thought, for observation, for simply being. Time did not feel scarce. It felt available. This sense of availability shaped how we remember those years now. We do not recall them as perfect or effortless, but as coherent. Life had a shape that could be felt. Days followed a pattern that offered reassurance without monotony. Change occurred within a stable framework, allowing individuals and communities to absorb it without losing themselves. Before screens became central, life unfolded at a human pace. It allowed people to grow into their roles, to learn through experience, and to carry forward habits that foster connection and understanding. These memories remain not as instructions to the present, but as quiet reminders of a way of being that valued presence, patience, and the gentle passage of time. As we moved through those years, the notion of progress was present, but it did not dominate thought in the way it later would. Improvements arrived gradually, often welcomed with curiosity rather than urgency. There was time to observe their effects, to decide how they fit into existing routines. Change was something to be considered, not assumed to be beneficial simply because it was new. This careful relationship with progress allowed people to remain anchored even as circumstances evolved. Daily life continued to be shaped by the physical world. Weather, distance, and material limits all played their part. If something broke, it was examined, repaired if possible, or replaced with deliberation. Objects were not easily discarded, partly because replacement required effort, but also because familiarity carried meaning. A repaired item told a story of use and care. It reminded us that things like people gained character through time and attention. Many of us remember how conversations unfolded without haste. Discussions were not optimized for efficiency. They wandered, paused, and returned to earlier points without apology. There was pleasure in the process itself, in the act of exchanging thoughts without a clear objective. Listening was not a strategy but a courtesy. Interruptions were rare, not because they were forbidden, but because patience was expected. This patience extended to learning. We were not urged to master everything quickly. Skill developed through repetition, through gradual refinement. There was respect for the apprentice stage, for the time it took to become competent. Rushing was often viewed with skepticism. Doing something properly mattered more than doing quickly. Homes reflected this philosophy. Spaces were arranged for use rather than display. Furniture was chosen for durability and comfort. Decorations accumulated slowly, often marking events or travels rather than trends. A room told the story of those who lived in it, not through deliberate design, but through lived experience. Nothing needed to be constantly updated to remain relevant. In family life, expectations were communicated subtly. Children observed how adults handled difficulty, how they spoke about others, how they responded to disappointment. These observations shaped behavior more effectively than direct instruction. Values were absorbed through example, reinforced by repetition. Over time, they became part of one's character, guiding decisions without conscious effort. Work and leisure remained distinct, though they informed one another. Satisfaction in work made rest meaningful. Rest restored energy for work. This balance was understood intuitively. There was no constant pressure to be productive during every waking moment. Idleness had a place. Reflection had a place. These moments were not seen as wasted, but as necessary intervals that allowed life to retain its rhythm. Public life, too, reflected these shared understandings. Gatherings followed familiar patterns. There was an ease in knowing what was expected, how one should behave, what role one played. This predictability was not restrictive. It provided a framework within which individuality could express itself without confusion or conflict. As years accumulated, memory formed a steady thread connecting past and present. People remembered not only events, but routines. The repetition of ordinary days created a sense of continuity that softened the impact of change. Even difficult periods were integrated into the larger narrative of a life, understood as phases rather than disruptions. When we recall those times now, what stands out is not a single defining feature, but an overall atmosphere. There was a feeling of steadiness, of life unfolding without constant urgency. Attention was not fragmented. It was directed toward what was immediately present, whether a task, a conversation, or a moment of quiet observation. This way of living fostered resilience without making it explicit. People adapted to circumstances because they were accustomed to working within limits. They adjusted plans according to weather, resources, and time. Flexibility was practiced daily, not discussed theoretically. It became a natural response rather than a deliberate strategy. As new generations grew within this environment, they inherited not only material conditions, but habits of mind. They learned to tolerate delay, to value effort, to appreciate continuity. These lessons were not framed as virtues to be admired, but as normal ways of engaging with the world. Even as the presence of screens began to increase toward the end of that period, the underlying rhythms remained influential. Life had already established its patterns. Attention had been trained differently. Many of us carried these habits forward, even as circumstances changed. They remained as internal references, shaping how we responded to new demands. Looking back, we can see that this period offered a particular relationship with time. It was not something to be managed aggressively, but something to be inhabited. Days were lived rather than optimized. Moments were experienced rather than captured. This approach allowed meaning to emerge gradually, through accumulation rather than intensity. Before screens fully entered daily life, there was a shared understanding that not everything needed to be immediate. Waiting, repetition, and presence were accepted parts of the human experience. They formed a quiet foundation upon which lives were built, relationships sustained, and memories formed. These memories do not serve as prescriptions for present. They are reflections, reminders of a different balance between attention and distraction, between speed and steadiness. They invite us to remember how it once felt to live within time rather than alongside it, to experience continuity without needing constant reinforcement. As the years continue to pass, this sense of continuity remains one of the most enduring aspects of that era. It is carried not in specific objects or practices, but in an internal rhythm, a way of approaching life that values patience, presence, and the quiet dignity of ordinary days. As life unfolded further along that familiar path, the relationship between people and their surroundings remained intimate and unmediated. We were shaped by the spaces we occupied every day, spaces that did not change often and therefore invited attention. A room was not merely a backdrop, but a participant in daily life. We knew where the light would fall at certain hours, how sound traveled through hallways, which chair was most comfortable in the late afternoon. This familiarity fostered a sense of belonging that required no affirmation. One felt at home not because it was declared so, but because the body recognized it. Time spent within these spaces allowed for reflection without effort. Thoughts arose naturally during repetitive tasks, during walks taken without destination, during moments of rest that were not filled with diversion. Thinking was not separated from living. It occurred alongside action, woven into the day rather than reserved for special moments. This integration gave thought a grounded quality. Ideas were shaped by experience, by what had been seen and done, rather than by constant exposure to external commentary. The absence of continuous external input meant that internal rhythms were more easily heard. One became aware of fatigue, of satisfaction, of restlessness, without needing a prompt. Decisions were guided by these internal signals as much as by external demands. When it was time to stop, one stopped. When it was time to begin again, one began. This attentiveness to oneself did not encourage self-absorption. On the contrary, it allowed individuals to participate more fully in shared life, because they were not constantly distracted from it. Many of us recall how evenings provided a natural pause for contemplation. As activity slowed, the day seemed to gather itself into memory. What had occurred was reviewed quietly, not as an analysis, but as a simple acknowledgement. Successes and disappointments alike found their place. Nothing needed to be resolved immediately. Sleep offered distance, and morning often brought clarity without effort. This rhythm supported emotional balance in subtle ways. Feelings were experienced without being amplified or suppressed artificially. Joy was allowed to be modest. Disappointment was accepted as temporary. There was an understanding, learned through repetition, that emotions moved through us just as days and seasons did. They were not fixed states, but passing conditions. This understanding fostered resilience without naming it. In social life, this balance manifested as restraint and consideration. People did not feel compelled to express every thought or feeling publicly. Privacy was respected as a natural boundary. One could withdraw without explanation and return without apology. This freedom to move between engagement and solitude was widely understood and rarely questioned. Work continued to play a central role in shaping identity, but it did so through contribution rather than visibility. One was known by what one did, not by how one presented it. Reputation was built slowly, through consistency rather than performance. Trust accumulated over time, reinforced by reliability. A promise made was expected to be kept, not because of enforcement, but because one's word carried weight. As years accumulated, the sense of continuity between past, present, and future became more pronounced. Life did not feel segmented into disconnected phases. Childhood, adulthood, and later years were understood as parts of a single unfolding story. This continuity offered perspective. Difficult moments were seen as chapters rather than conclusions. Joys were appreciated without clinging, because they were understood to belong to a larger flow. Education, both formal and informal, reinforced this perspective. Learning was valued not as a means of rapid advancement, but as a gradual expansion of understanding. Knowledge accumulated slowly, layered upon experience. There was respect for what one did not yet know and patience in acquiring it. Curiosity was encouraged, but not pressured. Questions were allowed to remain open. Public discourse reflected similar qualities. Discussions, when they occurred, were grounded in shared reference points. People spoke from experience rather than abstraction. Disagreement existed, but they were often framed within a context of mutual recognition. One could disagree without negating the other. This capacity for coexistence rested on a shared sense of proportion, on the understanding that no single issue defined the entirety of a person or community. The material limits of the time reinforced these habits of thought. Scarcity encouraged care. Abundance, when it appeared, was appreciated without excess. Consumption was guided by need and durability rather than novelty. This relationship with material goods fostered gratitude without sentimentality. One valued what one had because it was used, not because it was displayed. As screens began to occupy more space toward the edges of daily life, they entered an environment already shaped by these long-established rhythms. At first, they were tools used for specific purposes and then set aside. They did not yet redefine attention entirely. Life continued to be organized around physical presence, shared routines, and unhurried time. For many of us, the habits formed during those years persisted even as circumstances changed. We carried with us an internal sense of pacing, a preference for depth over breadth, for continuity over constant renewal. These preferences were not always articulated, but they influenced choices quietly and persistently. Looking back now, we can see how deeply these early patterns shaped our understanding of what it means to live well. They taught us to value presence without demanding intensity, to appreciate routine without mistaking it for stagnation, to accept change without surrendering continuity. These lessons were not delivered through instruction, but through daily life itself. The memory of that time remains gentle rather than insistent. It does not argue with the present or demand return. It simply offers a reference point, a reminder of how life once felt when attention was not endlessly divided and time was allowed to unfold according to its own quiet logic. Before screens became central to every interaction, there was space for living to occur without constant mediation. Experience was primary. Reflection followed naturally. Relationships developed through shared time rather than constant contact. This way of living fosters a sense of coherence that many of us still recognize within ourselves, even as the world around us has changed. As we continue to move forward, this internal coherence remains a form of inheritance. It is carried not in objects or customs alone, but in habits of attention, in expectations about time, and in appreciation for the ordinary. It reminds us that life can be rich without being crowded, meaningful without being accelerated, and deeply human without needing constant reinforcement. As the years continue to pass within that familiar rhythm, the experience of time itself remained grounded in continuity rather than urgency. Days were not perceived as units to be conquered or optimized, but as spaces to be inhabited. Morning, afternoon, and evening each carried their own character, and these distinctions were felt instinctively. We did not rush from one moment to the next in fear of falling behind. Instead, we moved with an understanding that each part of the day had its place and purpose. Many of us recall how attention was shaped through habit rather than effort. Without constant stimuli competing for notice, the mind learned to dwell on what was immediately present. A task, however simple, received full engagement. Sweeping a floor, repairing an object, writing a letter, or preparing a meal were not treated as interruptions to life, but as life itself. In giving attention to these activities, one found a quiet satisfaction that did not depend on recognition or reward. The sense of proportion that governed daily life extended to ambitions and expectations. Aspirations existed, of course, but they were tempered by realism and patience. Progress was measured over years rather than moments. There was an understanding that meaningful achievement required time, effort, and persistence. Success, when it came, was often modest in appearance but solid in substance. It rested on foundations built gradually, through consistency rather than acceleration. Relationships, too, developed according to this slower logic. Friendships deepened through shared experiences accumulated over time. There was no pressure to maintain constant contact. Absence did not imply distance. When people met again, conversation resumed naturally, grounded in familiarity rather than novelty. Trust was reinforced not by frequent affirmation, but by reliability demonstrated repeatedly. Family bonds were shaped by presence rather than planning. Time spent together was not always structured or intentional. yet it formed the core of shared memory. Ordinary moments, repeated daily, carry more weight than occasional events. The familiarity of voices, gestures, and routines created a sense of security that did not require explanation. One belonged simply by being there. The role of memory in shaping identity was particularly strong. Without constant external records, remembrance relied on internal recollection. Stories were carried within, recalled and retold according to context and need. Memory was not fixed or frozen. It evolved, enriched by reflection and perspective. This flexibility allowed the past to remain alive without becoming rigid. Many of us learned to respect limits through lived experience. Physical fatigue, emotional strain, and material constraints were encountered directly, not abstractly. These encounters taught discernment. One learned when to persist and when to pause, when to speak and when to remain silent. Such judgments were refined over time, guided by outcomes rather than instructions. The natural environment played an essential role in reinforcing these lessons. Changes in light, weather, and season provided a constant reminder of cycles larger than individual concerns. These cycles encourage humility and patience. They place personal experience within a broader context, fostering an awareness that life unfolded according to patterns that could be observed but not controlled. Public life mirrored this acceptance of rhythm and limit. Institutions moved at a pace that allowed participation and understanding. Decisions were not always quick, but they were deliberate. Processes unfolded visibly, allowing people to follow their progression. This transparency fostered trust. Even when outcomes were imperfect, one could see how conclusions had been reached, and this visibility mattered. The absence of immediate comparison also shaped self-perception. Without constant exposure to curated images or narratives, people measured themselves against their own experience and that of those around them. This localized frame of reference reduced anxiety and competition. One's life was understood within its own context rather than against an abstract ideal. As technology advanced gradually, it entered a culture already accustomed to deliberation. New tools were evaluated according to how they served existing needs. They were integrated selectively, not universally. This cautious adoption preserved balance. Attention remained anchored in the physical world, even as new possibilities emerged. For many of us, this balance became an internal standard carried forward into later years. Even as external conditions change, the habits formed earlier continue to influence behavior. We retain a preference for depth over speed, for continuity over constant change. These preferences were not always articulated, but they guided choices quietly and consistently. Looking back now, the memory of those years carries a sense of steadiness rather than nostalgia alone. It reminds us of a time when life felt coherent, when actions aligned naturally with values absorbed through observation and repetition. There was less need to explain oneself, because shared understandings were widely held. The passage of time did not feel threatening. Aging was accepted as part of the natural order. Each stage of life carried its own expectations and privileges. There was dignity in growing older, grounded in experience rather than visibility. Wisdom was recognized through presence and perspective, not through assertion. Before screens occupied the center of attention, there was room for uncertainty without anxiety. Not knowing was part of the human condition, not a failure to be corrected immediately. Questions could remain open. Plans could adapt. This tolerance for ambiguity fostered creativity and resilience, allowing individuals and communities to navigate change without losing their sense of self. As we reflect on those years now, we recognize that their influence extends beyond specific practices or routines. They shaped a way of relating to time, to others, and to oneself. They taught us to inhabit life rather than manage it, to trust processes that unfolded gradually, to value presence without requiring constant reinforcement. These lessons were not taught formally, yet they endured. They were embedded in daily life, reinforced by repetition, and carried forward quietly. Even as the world transformed, many of us retain an inner sense of pacing and proportion that continues to guide us. The memory of that era does not demand a return or resist progress. It simply offers perspective. It reminds us that life can be lived fully without constant acceleration, that meaning can emerge from continuity, and that attention, once trained to dwell on what is present, remains one of the most enduring forms of inheritance. As time continues its gentle passage, this inheritance remains available to us. It lives in habits of patience, in comfort with silence, in the ability to wait without resentment. It reminds us of how life once unfolded when moments were allowed to stand on their own, and when being present was not a choice to be made, but the natural state of things. As that long rhythm of living continued, the relationship between people and memory took on particular depth. Without constant reminders imposed from the outside, remembrance relied on internal cues. A smell, a sound, the angle of light at a certain hour could summon entire periods of life without effort. Memory was not something stored separately from experience. It was woven into it. The past surfaced naturally, often unexpectedly, and then settled back again without demanding attention. Many of us recall how stories circulated within families and communities, not as performances, but as continuations of shared experience. They were told and retold over years, sometimes decades, with small variations that reflected the moment of telling. No version was considered definitive. What mattered was not precision, but connection. Through these stories, individuals located themselves within a broader narrative, one that extended backward and forward beyond their own lives. This sense of continuity softened the passage of time. Aging did not feel like a sudden transition, but a gradual accumulation. One became older almost without noticing, guided by shifting responsibilities rather than by milestones announced loudly. The mirror changed slowly. Roles evolved naturally. There was time to adjust, to accept, to grow into new positions within family and society. Daily routines played a central role in this adjustment. Repetition provided stability, but it also allowed for subtle change. A task performed daily was never exactly the same. Circumstances varied, energy fluctuated, perspective shifted, yet the familiarity of the routine offered reassurance. It anchored life, allowing change to occur without disorientation. Many of us learned to appreciate small pleasures precisely because they were not amplified. A cup of coffee taken in silence, a walk taken at the same hour each day. The simple act of sitting and observing were not extraordinary, yet they carried lasting satisfaction. Their value lay in their consistency. They were available, reliable, and unassuming. The pace of life allowed for mistakes without catastrophe. Errors were corrected gradually. Consequences were faced, but they were rarely immediate or overwhelming. This gentler feedback encouraged learning rather than fear. One learned to take responsibility without being paralyzed by it. Confidence developed slowly, grounded in experience rather than affirmation. In social settings, this gradualism fostered tolerance. People were known in their complexity, not reduced to single actions or opinions. A disagreement did not define a relationship entirely. Time provided perspective. Patterns matter more than isolated moments. This allowed communities to absorb tension without fracturing, to adapt without losing cohesion. Work continued to shape identity, but it did so through contribution rather than visibility. Satisfaction came from doing something useful and doing it well. Recognition, when it came, was understated. It was embedded in trust, in being relied upon, in being asked again. These forms of acknowledgement carried more weight than praise expressed openly. The absence of constant evaluation also influenced self-understanding. Without continuous comparison, individuals developed a sense of worth grounded in their own experience. One knew what one could do, what one enjoyed, what one valued. These understandings emerged slowly, shaped by lived reality rather than by external metrics. Leisure maintained its quiet character. Time off was not treated as a reward to be maximized, but as a necessary counterbalance. Activities were chosen for enjoyment rather than productivity. There was room for aimlessness, for unstructured time that allowed curiosity to surface without direction. As the years progressed, changes in the broader world became more noticeable, yet they were filtered through established habits of attention. News arrived at certain times, through limited channels. It was absorbed gradually, discussed thoughtfully, and then set aside. There was less sense of being overwhelmed, because information arrived at a pace that allowed comprehension. This measured exposure shaped how people responded to uncertainty. Problems were acknowledged, but they were not constantly revisited. Concern did not become obsession. There was trust in the ability of time and collective effort to address difficulties, even if solutions were not immediately visible. Within families, the passage of generations reinforced this trust. Younger individuals observed older ones navigating change with composure. This observation provided reassurance that life could be managed, even when circumstances shifted. Resilience was transmitted not through advice, but through example. As screens gradually entered more aspects of daily life, they did so against this backdrop of accumulated habit. At first, they were conveniences rather than necessities. They did not yet command constant attention. People remained anchored in physical presence, in shared time, in routines that had proven themselves over decades. For many of us, the habits formed during these years persisted even as technology advanced. We retained an instinct to pause, to reflect, to wait. These instincts sometimes set us apart in later years, yet they also provided stability. They offered an internal compass when external conditions became more demanding. Looking back now, we recognize that this way of living cultivated a particular form of wisdom. It was not analytical or theoretical, but experiential. It arose from having lived within limits, from having observed cycles, from having accepted that not everything could or should be controlled. This wisdom manifested as patience, moderation, and a quiet confidence in the unfolding of life. The memory of that era remains gentle. It does not insist on superiority or lament loss loudly. It simply recalls a time when life unfolded at a pace that allowed meaning to emerge naturally. It reminds us that attention, once trained to dwell on what is present, remains capable of depth even in changing circumstances. As time continues its passage, these memories serve as a form of inheritance. They are carried within us, shaping how we respond to speed, to noise, to constant demand. They remind us that another way of living has existed, one grounded in presence, continuity, and trust in time. This remembrance does not seek to recreate the past. It acknowledges change as inevitable, yet it offers perspective, a quiet reference point against which we can measure our own experience. It suggests that life does not need to be crowded to be full, nor hurried to be meaningful. Before screens fully claimed attention, there was space for living to occur, without constant mediation. That space allowed individuals and communities to develop depth, resilience, and continuity. These qualities endure not as relics, but as internal guides, accompanying us as we continue to move forward through time. As those years extended into memory, the experience of belonging continued to shape daily life in ways that were felt more than articulated. One did not need to announce identity or position. It was understood through participation. People knew where they fit by what they did and how they related to others. This sense of place was not fixed or confining, but reassuring. It allowed individuals to act with confidence, grounded in shared understanding of roles that evolved naturally over time. Many of us remember how patience was woven into ordinary interactions. Conversations were not rushed to conclusions. Decisions were allowed to mature. There was a collective tolerance for delay that softened frustration and encouraged reflection. When outcomes took time, this was accepted as part of the process rather than interpreted as failure. Waiting carried dignity. It was not empty, but expectant, filled with a quiet awareness that some things unfolded only at their proper pace. The relationship with time extended beyond schedules and routines into a deeper awareness of duration. Projects spanned weeks or months. Relationships unfolded over years. Change was measured in small increments rather than dramatic shifts. This long view encouraged steadiness. It reduced the pressure to reinvent oneself constantly. One could grow gradually, allowing experience to accumulate and shape perspective. Many of us recall how competence was recognized through consistency. Doing something well once was appreciated, but doing it well repeatedly earned trust. Reliability mattered more than brilliance. This emphasis fostered humility and perseverance. It encouraged people to commit to tasks and relationships with the understanding that value emerged through sustained effort. Domestic life continued to reflect these values. The home was a place of continuity rather than display. Its rhythms provided a counterbalance to external demands. Returning home marked a transition from public to private life, from expectation to familiarity. This boundary protected intimacy and allowed individuals to rest without explanation. The absence of constant external input allowed inner life to develop quietly. Thoughts were not immediately challenged or reinforced by external opinions. One learned to sit with uncertainty, to form judgments slowly, to revise them over time. This internal dialogue cultivated discernment. It encouraged individuals to trust their own experience while remaining open to adjustment. In social settings, this discernment manifested as restraint. People spoke thoughtfully, aware that words carried weight. Silence was respected. It signaled consideration rather than disengagement. This balance between speech and silence allowed conversations to deepen, to explore nuance without haste. Work continued to be a central organizing force, yet remained integrated into life rather than dominated entirely. Even demanding roles were tempered by an understanding of limits. Exhaustion was acknowledged. Rest was not framed as indulgence, but as necessity. This acceptance prevented burnout from becoming a defining feature of identity. As communities evolved, shared experiences reinforced cohesion. Events were remembered collectively, discussed over time, integrated into local history. These shared memories created bonds that extended beyond individual relationships. They provided a sense of continuity that anchored people through change. The pace of technological advancement during those years allowed for adaptation without disorientation. New tools were introduced gradually, giving people time to learn and adjust. There was space for skepticism and discussion. Adoption was not automatic. It was shaped by perceived usefulness rather than novelty alone. For many of us, this measured approach fostered confidence in judgment. One learned to evaluate change rather than submit to it reflexively. This capacity became increasingly valuable as the pace of life accelerated later on. It provided a framework for discernment amid abundance. Memory from that period carries a particular texture. It is not dominated by highlights alone, but by a sense of continuity. Ordinary days merge into a stable background that supports recollection. Significant moments stand out precisely because they were not crowded by constant stimulation. This texture of memory influences how many of us experience the present. We retain an awareness of depth, of layers accumulated over time. We recognize that meaning often emerges slowly, through repetition and reflection rather than intensity. This recognition tempers impatience and fosters appreciation for gradual progress. As screens became more prominent, they entered lives already shaped by these habits of attention. For some, the transition was challenging. For others, it was manageable. In either case, the internal rhythms established earlier continued to exert influence. They served as reference points, guiding choices and responses. Looking back now, we can see how these early experiences cultivated a form of stability that endured beyond changing circumstances. They taught us to value presence over display, continuity over constant renewal, patience over immediacy. These values were not proclaimed but practiced daily. The memory of that era does not deny difficulty or idealize simplicity. It acknowledges effort, limitation, and uncertainty, yet it also recalls a balance that allowed life to feel coherent. Time was experienced as a companion rather than an adversary. Attention was directed rather than fragmented. As we carry these memories forward, they continue to inform how we navigate the present. They remind us that life can be lived fully without constant acceleration, that relationships deepen through shared time, that understanding grows through patience. This remembrance does not seek to halt progress or resist change. It simply offers perspective. It recalls a way of living in which moments were allowed to stand on their own, in which experience was primary and reflection followed naturally. Before screens became central to daily existence, life unfolded with a steadiness that many of us still recognize within ourselves. This steadiness remains available as an internal resource, guiding us through change with composure and continuity, reminding us that time, when respected, continues to offer space for living, learning, and quiet fulfillment. As the rhythm of those years carried on, the experience of learning through living became even more apparent with the passage of time. Knowledge was not confined to formal instruction or clearly defined stages. It emerged through repetition, through observation, and through the quiet accumulation of experience. Many of us learned what was expected of us not because it was explained in detail, but because we had seen it practiced consistently. This form of learning was subtle, yet enduring. It shaped judgment, behavior, and character without ever announcing itself. Mistakes played an essential role in this process. Errors were not immediately exposed or magnified. They were often addressed quietly, sometimes indirectly, allowing dignity to remain intact. This approach did not eliminate accountability, but framed it within a context of growth rather than failure. One learned to correct course without losing confidence, to accept imperfection as part of becoming competent. The presence of limits reinforced this perspective. Time, energy, and resources were finite, and this finitude was accepted rather than resisted. Planning accounted for these limits. Expectations were adjusted accordingly. This realism fostered resilience. People learned to work within constraints, finding satisfaction not in limitless possibility, but in meaningful effort. In daily life, this translated into an appreciation for gradual improvement. Skills were honed over years. Relationships matured slowly. There was an understanding that depth required time. This patience did not diminish ambition. It refined it. Goals were pursued steadily, without the pressure of immediate results. Progress, when it came, felt earned and secure. The shared environment reinforced these lessons. Living among others, one became aware of how individual actions affected the collective. Courtesy was not enforced formally, yet was widely practiced. One adjusted behavior instinctively, guided by consideration rather than rules. This mutual awareness created a sense of ease in public spaces. Order emerged naturally, sustained by shared understanding. As years passed, the accumulation of shared experience strengthened bonds within families and communities. Memories were layered, not replaced. Each new experience added to an existing foundation. This layering created depth. It allowed individuals to draw upon the past when facing new situations, providing perspective and reassurance. Many of us recall how the absence of constant distraction allowed for a clearer sense of self. Identity was not continually revised in response to external feedback. It developed gradually, shaped by roles assumed and responsibilities met. One knew who one was through what one did consistently, rather than through how one appeared momentarily. This clarity extended to values. What mattered became evident through practice rather than proclamation. Honesty, reliability, and consideration were demonstrated daily. They were not abstract principles, but lived realities. Over time, they became internalized, guiding behavior without conscious deliberation. The pace of life supported this internalization. Without constant urgency, there was time to reflect on experience. Lessons were absorbed gradually. Insights emerged naturally, often retrospectively. One understood events differently with time, as perspective broadened and emotions settled. This ongoing reinterpretation enriched memory rather than distorting it. Work remained a central aspect of life, yet was integrated into a broader context. It provided structure and purpose, but it did not define existence entirely. There was room for other forms of contribution, for care, for creativity, for rest. This balance prevented any single role from overwhelming the whole of life. As communities encountered change, these established habits provided stability. New circumstances were evaluated against existing values. Adaptation occurred, but it was selective. This discernment preserved coherence. It allowed people to embrace improvement without losing continuity. The gradual introduction of new technologies toward the later part of that era highlighted this capacity for discernment. Innovations were met with curiosity, but also with caution. Their usefulness was assessed in relation to daily life. They were adopted when they served clear purposes and set aside when they did not. Attention remained grounded in physical presence and shared time. For many of us, this grounding became an internal reference point. Even as external conditions shifted, we retained an instinct to pause, to consider, to integrate change thoughtfully. This instinct proved valuable as the pace of life accelerated in later years. It provided a counterbalance to constant stimulation. Looking back now, we recognize that these experiences cultivated a particular form of wisdom. It was not theoretical or analytical, but practical and embodied. It arose from having lived within limits, from having observed cycles of effort and rest, from having accepted that not everything could be controlled or predicted. This wisdom manifested as composure in uncertainty, patience in delay, and confidence in gradual progress. It allowed individuals to navigate change without losing themselves. It fostered a sense of continuity that extended beyond specific circumstances. The memory of those years carries this wisdom quietly. It does not present itself as instruction or nostalgia. It simply exists as an internal orientation, a way of relating to time, to effort, and to others. It reminds us that life can be meaningful without being hurried, that understanding can deepen without constant input. As we continue to move forward, these memories remain present, shaping how we respond to the demands of the present. They offer perspective amid speed, grounding amid abundance, and calm amid noise. They remind us of a time when life unfolded at a human pace, allowing experience to settle and meaning to emerge naturally. Before screens claimed a central place in daily existence, living involved a close relationship with time, with effort, and with others. This relationship fostered depth, resilience, and continuity. It shaped generations quietly, leaving traces that endure within us still. These traces do not call for a return to the past. They invite reflection. They suggest that even in changing circumstances, the qualities that sustain life then remain relevant now. Patience, presence, and respect for gradual growth continue to offer guidance, reminding us that time, when approached with care, remains an ally rather than an adversary. As those patterns of living continue to shape daily experience, the notion of legacy emerged quietly, without ceremony. It was not something discussed openly or pursued deliberately. It revealed itself through continuity, through the passing on of habits, attitudes, and ways of seeing the world. Many of us came to understand that what endured most was not what was declared, but what was practiced consistently over time. This sense of inheritance was subtle. It appeared in the way tasks were approached, in the patience shown toward difficulty, in the care taken with ordinary responsibilities. We learn how to act not through instruction, but through proximity. Watching others handle routine challenges, we absorb standards of conduct that later guided us without conscious effort. These standards were not rigid rules. They were flexible principles shaped by context and experience. Time played a central role in this transmission. Because life moved at a measured pace, there was space for observation. One could watch, reflect, and gradually adopt what seemed meaningful. Nothing was forced or accelerated. Understanding grew naturally, supported by repetition. Over time, these absorbed practices became part of one's own way of living. Many of us recall how respect for effort was cultivated quietly. Work was valued not only for its outcome, but for the care invested in it. Whether the task was large or small, doing it properly mattered. This respect extended to others as well. One recognized the effort behind actions, even when results were modest. This awareness fostered empathy and patience, allowing relationships to develop with mutual consideration. The relationship with time reinforced this empathy. Knowing that growth required patience, people allowed one another space to learn, to adjust, to improve. Mistakes were understood as part of the process, rather than as definitive judgments. This generosity of time softened interactions and reduced conflict. It encouraged persistence rather than withdrawal. As life progressed, the cumulative effect of these attitudes became evident. Individuals carried themselves with a quiet confidence rooted in experience rather than assertion. They knew what they could handle because they had handled similar situations before. This confidence did not require constant reinforcement. It was internal, sustained by memory and practice. Communities benefited from this internal stability. Shared expectations reduced friction. People anticipated one another's behavior with reasonable accuracy, allowing cooperation to occur smoothly. Differences existed, but they were navigated within a framework of mutual recognition. This framework did not eliminate disagreement, but it provided tools for managing it without escalation. The rhythm of days and seasons continued to support this equilibrium. Repetition did not dull awareness. It sharpened it. Familiar patterns allowed subtle changes to be noticed. One became attuned to variation within continuity, learning to appreciate nuance rather than novelty alone. This sensitivity enriched experience, making ordinary life feel layered and meaningful. As years accumulated, the distinction between past and present softened. Memories did not remain fixed in a distant place. They surfaced naturally, informing current choices and interpretations. The past was not idealized, but it was integrated. It offered perspective, reminding individuals that challenges had been faced before and could be faced again. This integration fostered resilience. Change, when it came, was approached with caution but not fear. People trusted their capacity to adapt because they had adapted repeatedly over time. This trust reduced anxiety and allowed for thoughtful response rather than reaction. The gradual emergence of screens toward the center of daily life began to alter these dynamics, yet the foundation remained influential. For many, the habits formed earlier provided a counterbalance. They encouraged moderation, discernment, and the preservation of boundaries. Screens became tools rather than total environments, at least for a time. Looking back now, we can see how deeply these earlier experiences shaped our understanding of what it means to live well. They emphasize continuity over intensity, depth over breadth, and presence over performance. These emphases were not articulated as ideals. They were lived realities, reinforced by daily practice. The memory of that era carries a particular calm. It does not insist on comparison or judgment. It simply recalls a way of living that allowed people to grow into their roles gradually, supported by shared rhythms and mutual understanding. It reminds us that life can be full without being crowded, meaningful without being hurried. As we reflect on these memories, we recognize that their value lies not in their uniqueness, but in their universality. Many people, in many places, experience similar rhythms and learn similar lessons. This shared experience connects us across time and circumstance, offering a sense of continuity that transcends individual lives. The legacy of those years is not confined to specific practices or objects. It lives on in attitudes toward time, effort, and relationship. It influences how we respond to pressure, how we value patience, how we approach change. It remains present as an internal guide, shaping behavior quietly and persistently. As the world continues to evolve, this internal guide remains relevant. It reminds us that attention is finite and valuable, that relationships deepen through shared time, and that understanding grows through experience rather than acceleration. These reminders do not resist progress. They simply encourage balance. Before screens dominated daily life, there was space for living to unfold without constant mediation. That space allowed individuals and communities to develop coherence, resilience, and depth. These qualities endure within us, not as nostalgia, but as lived knowledge. As we move forward, carrying both memory and adaptation, this knowledge offers reassurance. It suggests that even amid rapid change, the fundamental rhythms that sustain human life remain accessible. They can be revisited, not by recreating the past, but by honoring the principles that guided it. In this way, the memory of those years continues to serve as a quiet companion. It walks alongside us, offering perspective without demand, reminding us that time, when approached with patience and care, remains a source of continuity, understanding, and quiet fulfillment. As those long patterns of living settled into memory, the sense of completion did not arrive as an ending, but as a gentle understanding. Life, as it had been lived then, did not move toward conclusions with urgency. It unfolded in cycles, returning again and again to familiar points, each time with slightly altered perspective. This circular movement gave meaning to experience without demanding resolution. One did not feel compelled to define life sharply. It was enough to live it attentively. Many of us came to recognize, often only later, how profoundly this way of living shaped our inner landscape. The habits formed in those years remained present even as circumstances changed. They influenced how we approach difficulty, how we value time, how we related to others. These influences were quiet and persistent. They did not announce themselves, yet they guided behavior steadily. As the pace of the world gradually increased, these internal rhythms sometimes fell out of step with new demands. Yet they also provided stability. When confronted with speed and noise, many of us instinctively sought moments of stillness. We paused where others rushed. We listened where others reacted. These responses were not deliberate acts of resistance. They were simply expressions of a way of being learned long ago. The memory of that earlier time carries with it a particular sense of dignity. Life was not framed as a performance, nor was identity shaped through constant display. One's worth was understood through contribution, through reliability, through presence. This understanding fostered self-respect without arrogance and humility, without diminishment. It allowed individuals to stand comfortably within themselves. Relationships formed within this framework possess a certain depth. They were not maintained through constant contact, but through shared history. Time spent together accumulated meaning gradually. Trust developed through experience rather than declaration. These bonds proved resilient, capable of withstanding distance and change without dissolving. As years passed, the simplicity of many routines revealed itself as strength rather than limitation. Familiar patterns reduced cognitive burden, freeing attention for observation and reflection. This freedom allowed people to notice subtle shifts, to respond thoughtfully rather than reflexively. It fostered a form of intelligence rooted in awareness rather than information alone. The acceptance of silence played a central role in this awareness. Silence was not feared or avoided. It was recognized as a space in which understanding could emerge. In quiet moments, thoughts settled into clarity. Emotions found balance. Decisions matured. Silence offered rest not only to the body, but to the mind. Looking back, many of us recognize that boredom, as it was once experienced, served a purpose. It opened a space for imagination, for curiosity, for self-discovery. Without immediate solutions offered from outside, one learned to engage with one's own inner resources. This engagement cultivated creativity and resilience, qualities that remain useful throughout life. The relationship with time fostered gratitude without sentimentality. Moments were appreciated because they were lived fully, not because they were rare or spectacular. Ordinary days carried weight precisely because they were repeated. Through repetition, they formed the substance of life, the steady ground upon which memory rested. As the decades advanced, and screens gradually assumed a more central role, these earlier experiences did not vanish. They became part of a layered understanding of life. New ways of living were added, not entirely replacing what had come before. For some, the transition felt seamless. For others, it required adjustment. Yet the foundation remained influential, shaping responses to novelty and change. In remembering that earlier time, we do not deny its challenges or limitations. Life was not free from hardship, uncertainty, or loss. Yet these difficulties were met within a framework that allowed for endurance. People relied on routine, on relationship, on patience. These supports did not eliminate suffering, but they provided context and continuity. The absence of constant external validation allowed individuals to develop a sense of sufficiency. One did not need continual confirmation to feel secure. Satisfaction arose from effort, from contribution, from belonging. This efficiency reduced anxiety and fostered contentment without complacency. As we reflect now, with the distance of years, we can see how this way of living cultivated a form of wisdom that remains relevant. It taught us to respect limits, to value presence, to trust gradual growth. These lessons were not framed as ideals, yet they shaped behavior profoundly. The memory of that era does not seek to instruct or persuade. It simply exists, offering a perspective shaped by lived experience. It reminds us that human life can flourish within rhythm, routine, and restraint. It suggests that meaning emerges not from constant novelty, but from sustained engagement with the familiar. As time continues its passage, these memories accompany us quietly. They influence how we navigate complexity, how we respond to speed, how we choose to allocate attention. They remind us that even amid rapid change, there remains value in patience, in listening, in allowing moments to unfold without interference. Before screens took over everything, life offered a particular kind of coherence. It allowed individuals and communities to develop depth through repetition, understanding through observation, and connection through shared time. This coherence did not demand perfection. It simply provided a framework within which life could be lived fully. In carrying these memories forward, we do not seek to recreate the past. We acknowledge that the world has changed and will continue to do so. Yet, we also recognize that the principles embedded in that earlier way of living remain accessible. They can be honored in new forms, adapted to new circumstances. In this sense, the past remains present, not as a destination, but as a reference. It offers reassurance that life, when approached with patience and attention, retains its capacity for meaning. It reminds us that time, rather than being an enemy to be conquered, can be a companion, guiding us gently through the unfolding of days. As we stand within the present, shaped by both memory and change, this understanding offers calm. It suggests that beneath the layers of novelty and acceleration, the essential rhythms of human life endure. They continue to invite us into a way of being that values presence, continuity, and the quiet dignity of ordinary existence. And so, before screens took over everything, we live within a cadence that allowed life to settle into us. That cadence remains, carried forward through memory, shaping how we perceive time, how we relate to one another, and how we understand what it means to live well.